Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol is observed. Wow, that was an amazing presentation. I'm sure everybody enjoyed those insightful presentations, those informative anecdotes. But for me, ladies and gentlemen, mine is a simple task. In the next few minutes, I aim to give you a summary of the key requirements to list on the various boards of the BSC. The key word here is summary, because even if I wished, I could never give you a thorough presentation of the principles and rules of the BSC in a day's session, let alone in 20 minutes. This is why any company wishing to list needs to have a sponsoring broker. And a sponsoring broker can be any of the 4 members of the Botswana Stock Exchange. And you also need advisors. That means your lawyers, your accountants, who can ensure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed. Furthermore, I believe if I was to go into details, most would fall asleep within the first 2 paragraphs, because it does kind of get boring. It's the unsexy part of the job at the BSC. All right, and yes, please note the disclaimer. The views, opinions, and graphics and videos expressed in this presentation do not present the position of the Botswana Stock Exchange, its management, or the presenter. Formal positions are presented in writing by the BSC main committee. So I hope that just because you tick off all the boxes that I'm going to present here, you note that it doesn't mean your listing is approved right at this conference. How do I move this thing? Oh, there we go. Anyway, let's get into it. The truth is, regulation is the lifeblood of any exchange, any stock exchange. In order to provide and operate a fair, transparent, and efficient stock market, regulations must be made up and set up to international standards and must be applied evenly so as to promote investor confidence. At the BSC, investors' interests are well protected under this capital market structure. When you submit your application to the BSC to consider listing your company, the first port of call will be the Listings and Trading Department. Of course, as I mentioned, the preparation of the listing, the process of preparing the listing itself, involves several experts, including your sponsoring broker, and it's through your sponsoring broker that you submit your listing to the Botswana Stock Exchange. And the listing is first considered by the Listings and Trading Executive Committee, who then submit their recommendation to the Listings and Trading Subcommittee. It is the main committee of the Botswana Stock Exchange who make decisions on whether or not to list your company. And I'll also note that the Botswana Stock Exchange falls under the purview of the non-bank Financial Institutions Regulatory Authority, or the NBFIRA. So if there's any change to the rule, if we need to make any changes to the rules, that has to be approved by the NBFIRA. So if I may just go do an overview of the listing process. As I said, the first step is to prepare your company for listing. And then the second step would be to submit your application for listing through your broker. Now, the application process itself can be a back and forth. Depends on how good your application is. But if it's, you have very good advisors, which we do have in this country, it should be within a period of 30 working days from the first submission to getting your formal approval. The third step would be the marketing and the book building. Sometimes it's referred to as roadshow, the roadshow part. So after you get your approval for listing, you get your prospectus approved, then you go on a roadshow. You speak to the fund managers, you speak to the investors. Ladies and gentlemen, how about the BTCL roadshow? I mean, the response that they are getting, 1,000 applications per day, that is historic. We haven't seen that ever in the history of the stock exchange. So that would be something that you'd have to go through. We encourage companies to follow the BTCL model, to speak to the retail investors, more than we encourage them to speak to the fund managers. Because the fund managers, you see, they buy and hold, so that doesn't really make the brokers happy. The commission, I think, I'm not going to disclose Mr. Makhate's secret from this morning. This fourth step is admission to listing. So after you have gone through your roadshow and you have your subscriptions and you have made your allocations, you submit your final list of shareholders to the stock exchange. And if it meets the minimum requirements, then the BSE main committee will write you a formal approval. And the fifth and a rather important step, which should not be forgotten, is post-listing. As the panel members showed earlier, operating as a listed company is totally different from operating as a private company. Ladies and gentlemen, when you become a listed company on the BSE, you will join the most iconic brands in this country. I must point out that only those companies which are not behind in their listing fee payments have been included on this. Okay, that's a joke, but yes, listing has a cost. It has cost implications, ladies and gentlemen, right from the beginning of the process. The cost implications do not stop only with the advisors. Some advisors are more expensive than others in the process, but also with respect to the ongoing sustaining fees, which an issuer needs to take into consideration. Now at the BSE, you can list on any of these platforms. There is the main board of the Botswana Stock Exchange. There is the Venture Capital Board. And as already alluded to, we also have the Exchange Traded Funds Board. We also do list corporate bonds. And as recent as last year, we have now introduced the Serala OTC Board. The Serala OTC Board. The OTC stands for over-the-counter. I'll expand a little bit of that in a moment. A key listing principle, ladies and gentlemen, which the BSE main committee considers, is that securities should be brought to the market in a way that is appropriate, which will facilitate an open and efficient market for trading. So what does this mean? Your company must be carefully prepared to issue publicly traded securities. It must be a real company, not a fly-by-night. It must be cleanly, professionally run, and its affairs, it must be prepared to have its affairs run in a manner which makes it an open book affair. And of course, as I alluded to earlier, a listed company must have a shareholding structure which is appropriate for free and open public trading. As you will note, the recently upgraded equity trading requirements on which my presentation is focusing have been crafted with a deliberate effort to only list companies which have a shareholding which includes retail investors, with the view and aim of including more local individual investors. From our point of view, with more participants, we will see more liquidity on the market, and hence there will be more efficient price discovery. So just to dig down in very briefly, the conditions for the main board in the new rules, which will become effective from the 1st of June. The minimum subscribed capital is going to be 5 million pula. You need 3 years minimum profit history. And the minimum free float is now 30% from 20%. The minimum number of public shareholders remains at 300, but as I said, BTCL has, I believe, more than 30,000 shareholders at the moment. That's an ongoing process. But I got this information from the newspapers, so it's not inside information or anything, I think, yes. There has to be a portion of promoters' shares locked in for 2 years. So if you're a promoter, Mr. Sabelo Taselo there, if he lists Sabelo's Express, he will not be able to trade 75% of his portion for 2 years. So if you are a promoter of a company, you cannot trade your shares for at least 2 years. That's just to make sure that you are there with us. You are there with the small investor. You're not just there to list at 1 pula and sell at 120 and go away. The venture capital board is slightly less strenuous in terms of the minimum requirements. You don't need a profit history. You can be a brand new company. Mr. Gulam earlier mentioned that 10-Star started on this board. In the current rules, the minimum subscribed capital is 500,000, but in the new rules, the minimum capital will be 2.5 million. The minimum free float is 10%, and the minimum number of shareholders is 100. Once again, the promoter has to have 75% of his holding locked in for 2 years. With respect to exchange-traded funds, the parameters which I spoke about earlier, most of them don't apply, except that an exchange-traded fund, by its nature, is a derivative. So it derives its value from something. And that something is what I've referred here as security. So if you are talking about new gold, the gold bullion stored somewhere in Europe or wherever it is, that's the security. So when I buy a unit of new gold, that money is used to buy a piece of gold, and that's the security. So, as Mr. Tsaule earlier pointed out, the BSC has, in recent years, looked for depth outside of listing equity instruments only, as you can see with the ETFs. However, we await Botswana corporate finance and investment institutions to issue locally based ETFs. Where's the diamond ETF? What about cattle ETF? I recently read about forward contracts on beef carcasses on the JSE. Innovation is happening there. Why can't we do it here? The regulators are willing and ready to listen. And I must at this juncture thank our regulator for their support of our innovation. We wouldn't be able to innovate if we didn't have regulators who say, I am listening. tell me, what is this? And they have afforded us the opportunity to work with them in introducing these new innovations on our market. So thank you, NBFIRA. Corporate bonds also remain in demand by the market. Our bond rules are currently under review and will take into account retail bonds, foreign currency denominated bonds. In fact, we can list this today. Our ATS system has the capability to list foreign currency denominated bonds. Let me quickly talk about the Sarala OTC board. What it is not, it does not give you a listing, but a registration. It's a transitionary board. It's cheaper. There is less regulation. And it's also suitable for businesses in the banking and financial services arena, with multiple clients who may have a need for a secondary market to be created for their short to medium-term contracts. For example, I'll mention that we are in discussions with BBS. We have thousands of account holders who may wish to trade their paid-up shares amongst themselves. So where does the OTC Sarala board idea come from? Well, it comes out of the fact that the BSC has excess capacity in its ATS and settlement facilities at the CSDB, and therefore can avail these facilities to unlisted securities to trade their unlisted securities, unlisted entities to trade their unlisted securities. So banks are welcome to talk to us so we can look into giving their clients options to trade their, for example, 12-month fixed deposit accounts, for example. By the way, we haven't discussed this idea with BOB, so remember my disclaimer, don't quote me on what I just said. The only caveat about this board is that applicant issuers must be PIEs. And what is a PIE? It's a it's a public interest entity. And what is that? It's any organization regulated by BSC, NBFIRA, or Bank of Botswana, or if, according to the BAOA rules, regulations, the regulations which emanate from the Financial Reporting Act, if at the end of the preceding accounting year, the company has exceeded at least two of the following thresholds: annual revenue of 300 million, number of employees 200, total assets 200 million, total liabilities 100 million. So here we're talking about your motor centers, for example, which are private companies, but they can be, based on these rules by the BAOA, they are referred to as public interest entities based on these, any of these parameters. And as a result of that, they have to produce audited financial results. And that's really the only regulation that you need to satisfy to be registered on this, what we believe is a transitionary board. That's why we call it the Sarala board. And the Sarala here, I'm not talking about, as we young people today call the stage a Sarala. No. Like in the old times, the Sarala was a place where they put the mabele or sorghum to dry and get ready to be threshed. So basically, within a 5-year period, we'll be helping this particular company, which is registered on the Sarala OTC board, to become a listed company, to graduate to the list. Okay, I have just been sure that I'm quite late. I didn't see, how many minutes was that? 0 minutes. There's no way I'm going to cover all this in 0 minutes. But anyway, there you go. The main methods of listing. I can either go through an initial public offer, or you can do an introduction into the market, but you have to appoint a market maker if you're just going to do an introduction. And underwriting is mandatory. Another key principle is that once you are listed, you must realize that you now run a business in the public arena, and secrecy in dealings is no longer possible. So you now have to please the insatiable desire of Mr. Market, who wants to know everything you are doing all the time, so that he can decide whether to punt or not. So disclosure is the key word. It must become a part of your company's culture, both in management and at board level. So what are the next steps? As I said, as my CEO said, come and see us. We are open for business. Appoint a sponsoring broker. Let's talk. We can help you through that process. We have 4 brokers. You can just choose one of those guys. They are also mandated to help you through that process. After that, submit your listing application and get your company listed.